During the efforts, so-called, of the House Select Committee in the 1970s, several investigators were allowed to look at secret CIA documents. They were not allowed to take notes. We don't have notes. They were not allowed to photocopy, but they did read the documents. And among the documents they read was a list of the CIA operatives, and also FBI, that were used to infiltrate Jim Garrison's office. They were there to disrupt, they were there to steal the files, they were there to help Clay Shaw, the person whom Garrison had indicted for participation in the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. And they remembered several people that I've talked to. I talked to at least two, L.J. Delsa, and there's also Eddie Lopez's recollections of the list of those names. One of them was Pershing Gervais, who was Garrison's first chief investigator in the office of the district attorney. Well, then we finally got FBI reports that show Gervais was telling whatever he learned about, and Garrison trusted him. Garrison was far too trusting, and even trusted Pershing Gervais to interview Jack Martin, one of the important witnesses that he found who could testify to what was going on in Guy Bannister's office. So we have a variety of figures. We have a figure named Bill Boxley. Boxley he was with the CIA. There's no doubt about that. He'd been a CIA operative, and then he says he left the agency, but of course now we know nobody ever leaves the agency. And then he went into Garrison's office, and whenever there was a lead, Boxley would say there's nothing to it. Or Boxley was also behind Garrison, one of the mistakes that Garrison made, which was to charge a man named Edgar Eugene Bradley as participating in this conspiracy. Bradley, whatever you want to say, was innocent. And in later years, Garrison felt so bad about that, he apologized to Bradley, and Bradley forgave him. He's a religious man, he forgave him. But Garrison said he was just duped. He was controlled by other people, and Boxley was behind that. Boxley was also behind the idea that they should discount Beckham. They had letters from people saying, take a look at this guy. Take a look at Omaha. Take a look at Thomas Edward Beckham, and about, there's nothing in it, and so forth. And this time Garrison didn't listen to Boxley. Eventually Garrison fires Boxley in December of 1968, just before the short trial, but a lot of damage had been done. And there were other figures who stole the files, there was one character named Tom Bethel who took the witness list for the Shaw trial and handed over to Shaw's legal team. That's on the record. And then cried and whatever. But he might tell you that he thought that Garrison was wrong, but that is not exactly the right thing to do.
Why were those agents infiltrating Garrison's investigation?
These agents were infiltrating Garrison's investigation on behalf of the CIA, and Garrison was getting awfully close to the truth. Garrison was finding the CIA's hand in so much of this evidence. For example, Garrison was certain that Clay Shaw was shepherding Lee Harvey Oswald around the state of Louisiana on behalf of the CIA. Certainly Clay Shaw, who liked to be a socialite, who was the managing director of the International Trade Mart, would not have found in Lee Harvey Oswald a typical friend and companion. Shaw liked the high life. He liked society. What's he doing with Oswald? And yet we find, along with another CIA operative named David Ferry, that Shaw and Ferry are driving Lee Harvey Oswald up to these little towns north of Baton Rouge called Clinton and Jackson. Well, when Garrison looked at that, and he had massive evidence of that, he said, well, why is Shaw doing this? It must be on behalf of someone else. After the JFK Act was passed in 1992, I suppose, after Oliver Stone's film, the records were released, and we see Clay Shaw's CIA file, and we see that Shaw was a long-time CIA operative. Now, the people who represent the CIA's interests would like to say that Shaw was just another businessman. They all use the same word, routinely debriefed by the domestic contact service. But in fact, when we look at those reports of what Shaw did for the CIA, we find not that he was just debriefed, but that he was given specific assignments. Find out who's involved against Perón, find out what the various economic questions, who's in the opposition, what is the army doing, and in a whole variety of countries of Latin America. And then Shaw would indeed report, and also Eastern Europe, So we can see that Shaw was doing work. Then the next line of defense was that Shaw left the CIA and didn't work for them anymore after 1956. And of course we know, as one of the CIA operatives in New Orleans said, William Godet, they always say that. They always give a year. It was over. It was never over. And he spoke about himself as well. So Garrison discovers Shaw's relation to the CIA, but he, of course, doesn't have the documentation we have. And then he sees these connections. Now, what has happened since, because Garrison is still being attacked to this date, 2007, a vicious attack again in Vincent Bugliosi's book, which is called, very ironic, Reclaiming History. The one thing that Patricia Lambert, who is an author who has written against Garrison, and Bugliosi's chapter on Garrison is a holograph of Lambert's book about Garrison. The one thing that these people must do is to not deny that Oswald was ever up in Clinton and Jackson with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Lambert, of course, has the disadvantage of having read the notes of Garrison's investigator, Ann Dishler, which proved beyond a doubt that Oswald was up there with a variety of witnesses. And she creates this sort of very strange story there to deny. Bugliosi absolutely has it in a footnote, the Clinton and Jackson events. Very important because, of course, this whole business about going up there, we can talk about why Ferry and Shaw took Oswald up to Clinton and Jackson, but it absolutely proves that there was a conspiracy. There's just no question about it. What are you going to do with that? None of the people who were from Clinton or Jackson ever were interviewed by the Warren Commission. And after the assassination, Oswald's face is on television, and the people in Clinton and Jackson's look on, they say, "Oh my God, he was here." And one person who was a state representative up there named Reeves Morgan called the FBI and said, Oswald was here. And ever after, the FBI denied they ever got that call. However, I was able, I take this as one of my achievements for, if I may, immodestly, take this as an achievement, that I found the resident agent of the FBI. Now, the field office was in New Orleans, but the FBI had a resident agent in Baton Rouge. This man named Elmer Litchfield, who was, I think, a sheriff when I spoke to him in East Baton Rouge. And he said, a fellow agent of his confirmed that indeed they passed Clinton Courthouse one day in the car, and he said, "Oh, that's the place where Oswald and that other guy were." Wow. So, really, it's very rare for an FBI agent to be as honest as that. But this is a rather wonderful man, and he was honest with me. So, of course, they were there. Not to mention that the witnesses that Garrison found, whom he brought to the trial of Clay Shaw, were half African American, and half of them were Caucasian. If you understand anything about race relations in the South, in 1963, what you know, and one of the women told me, Verla Bell, who's one of the great witnesses, did not testify at the Shaw trial, but she was in Corps, so she was in town that day when Oswald appeared with David Ferry and Clay Shaw. And I asked her, "Did you ever speak to," I can't remember whichever one of the white witnesses. She said, "Was he white? If he was white, a black person would never have spoken to him. They just simply didn't speak." That's what segregation was about. So these people could not have, as was another third line of defense, was, well, they all conspired to create this false story about Oswald, Ferry, and Shaw. Well, they couldn't even have spoken to each other. People were terrified. It was a miracle that Jim Garrison got so many people to come and testify at the trial of Clay Shaw. And one of the things that happened, one of the African American witnesses named Corey Collins told me that he was the chairman of Corps, so he was a very big figure, and he had been working for the post office in Baton Rouge. And he told me that he was fired. That is, he couldn't get back in time for, I don't remember, they made a call to his home and said, "You have to come in on Saturday morning." He was planning to come back get there by Monday, and they fired him. And I said, "Did you tell Jim Garrison?" And he said, "No, he didn't." It was there. So these people made sacrifices to tell the truth. And the idea that this didn't happen is grotesque. And yet, Bugliosi seems to, well, I don't know if he's getting away with it. I don't think he's necessarily getting away with it. I mean, he makes a lot of noise, but I don't think he's getting away with this.